Okay, we're on 67b, about halfway through the page. And we're at Nisgaru Holach Achar Pogum Shibishneim.
Okay.
Third to bottom of the narrow lines.
Oh, okay.
Two dots.
Nigaru?
Nisgaru. Yep. Okay.
Well, you say they know. I say Nishgaru.
Now, the statement here was a statement of Ravin. Ravin says that if a non-Jew marries a non-Jew, so then you go by the male. So, for example, we said a non-Jew marries a non-Jew. So let's say a Mitzri male marries an Ammoni female.
Okay, right.
Child is a Mitzri.
Okay.
What happens if they both converted, the Mitzri and the Ammoni? So then we go by the blemish in either one. So the Gemara wants to know, what's the story? If we're talking about a male Mitzri who marries a female Ammonis, my pagamika, Ammoni v'Ammonis. A female Ammoni, what we call an Ammonis, is not, there's no prohibition. As we said, Ammoni has the exception that it's only the males that are prohibited, not the females. So there's no blemish at all. Ella, it must be, the Ammoni shenasa mitzvahs. We're talking about a male Ammoni that marries a female Mitzri. And now what happens is as follows. The Izachar Hava, if the child is a male, so then we treat them as an Ammoni, like the female side, which is more stringent. They're prohibited forever. Shadeh Abasra Dideh. The Ibn Keva Hava, and if the child is a female, Shadeh Abasra Didah, we go based on the female, which is a Mitzri. So we treat if the child would be a male, then we treat him as an Ammoni. He's prohibited forever. The child is a female, so from the perspective of the Ammoni, she would be permitted because the prohibition is only on males, not on females. But then we treat her as a Mitzri, and we say she has to have 3 generations. Okay, Kol she'ein lo olav Kiddushin. This is a little complicated one. If there's no Kiddushin at all, I'm sorry. It's two segments here. The first segment is she's an Ereva, basically. She's a relative. Mm-hmm. She's somebody who's otherwise eligible for Kiddushin, but because of her relationship, or because she's already married, she's not eligible to this person. The halacha is there's no Kiddushin. And the Gemara basically has 5 different ways to prove this. Not only is there no Kiddushin, but also the child is a mamzer. Minan immediately. How do we know this? And it was brought in the name of Rabbi Yanai. Rav Acha Brederovo and Rav Acha Brederovo, and they said it in the name of Rabbi Yisek Lili. So this is a statement that goes back to the Tanakh period. Omar Kro, the verse states, this is a man who gets divorced, a man who divorces his wife. V'yotza, she leaves the marriage. V'hoisa, v'yotza mibesa, she leaves the marriage. V'hocha v'hoisa l'Ish Acher, she goes ahead and marries Ish Acher. What does Ish Acher mean? Another man. The critical word here is la'acher means somebody else, meaning la'acherim, to outsiders. V'lo l'krovim, but not to relatives. In other words, the Torah basically is saying, when does Kiddushin work? To outsiders. To relatives, Kiddushin doesn't work.
Which page?
67b, and about 5 lines into the wide lines. So the first source is V'haisa l'Ish Achar. L'Ish, she only her Kiddushin only works l'Ish Achar, to an outsider. To a relative, there's no Kiddushin at all. Maskal Rababa ve'ema l'Achar v'lo l'ben. Maybe this means is that she can marry somebody else, but she can't marry her son. So the Gemara says, a son, ben behedik sivmi. The Torah specifically says you can't marry your son. La yigach eshes aviv. A person can't marry his father's wife. So obviously she cannot marry her husband's son. So So what does the Torah mention about somebody else? It must be somebody else is a general statement that excludes relatives, all the ervas. No, still not. Why not? Because maybe both statements refer to her son. In other words, his son, her ex's son, can't marry her.
So in other words, Rabbi, it's all relative.
Her ex's son can't marry her. Okay, now what about the fact that the Torah already repeated itself? Torah already wrote that. Gemara says, in other words, maybe the Torah is saying, number one, don't do it, and number two, that even if you did do it, there's no Kiddushin in that scenario. One second, I'm sorry, hold on. Yeah, no. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Lechatchilo me'achos ish nafka." In other words, we don't need a verse to tell me that you shouldn't marry a erva. You shouldn't even attempt to marry an erva, because just like achos isha, marrying your wife's sister is a prohibition of kares, and the Torah says don't marry her. That means when the Torah says in each individual erva, this is a prohibition, what the Torah means to say is that there's no Kiddushin either. Penalty of marrying your wife's sister is merely kares, whereas the penalty of marrying your husband's son or your father's wife, same person, is a penalty that is executed by the court. So that's the case. Like Kolshkin, certainly it should be the case that you shouldn't be marrying them. Okay. So in other words, we know that if you're an erva, you can't get married, and we know that if the Torah repeats the erva, the Torah is saying that at least with regard to chayv mitzvahs besdin, where the penalty is execution, capital punishment, that that the Kiddushin isn't valid in the first place. Okay, so now, again, so we have what is the source? How do we know? We're trying to make a general statement that all ervas don't have Kiddushin, and the source is v'haisel ish acher v'lo l'kroivim. She can marry another person, but not a relative. Maybe that other person we're referring to is not just any relative. Maybe it's actually talking about this specific instance of a chayis isha. Maybe this verse is referring to a wife's sister. In other words, you can go ahead and marry whoever you want, except that she can't get married to somebody who was married to her sister, if her sister is still alive. And moreover, not only can't you get married to them, but the Kiddushin actually isn't valid. Then that's what this pasuk teaches you. So Mara says, you're right. That could be the verse. So we find achayis isha, wife's sister. We have a source that says there is no Kiddushin. Shar rayis minol. And how do we know about other types of ervas? So the Gemara says, Yafina me'achayis isha. You learn what we call mematzino, which is direct comparison to achayis isha, a wife's sister. A wife's sister is an example of a regular erva, where the penalty is kares, and if you engaged in the act accidentally, then the penalty would be then you'd have to bring a korban. And there's no Kiddushin at all. So anything with a similar erva also does not have Kiddushin. Now, the truth of the matter is that every erva, even the ones that are also have a penalty of execution, if there's still a penalty of kares as well in all these scenarios. Let's say just like the violation of Shabbos, if you have witnesses, there would be capital punishment. If you don't have witnesses, there would still be kares. So really, all ervas go into this category of chayv krisis. And therefore, we have a source that tells me that all of them do not have Kiddushin. Okay, so in the first version, we learn V'haisel ish achar is referring to a wife's sister, but all ervas are learned from a wife's sister, from that specific erva. Okay, so Vishna Kulu Asin. Okay, they can basically, I understand you can make the comparison and argue that they all do not have Kiddushin. A married woman and a brother's wife are different. Why? Okay. In other words, to make a direct comparison is fair, except that some of these erevas are more lenient, actually. What's an example of a more lenient ereva? A brother's wife. Why? Because you can do yibum. So this is not one of those, most erevas are permanent. This one is an exception. There's sort of the Torah sort of carves out an exception here that in the case of yibum, you can marry your brother's wife. So it's not, you can't make a direct comparison because in a certain sense, this is a more lenient category. Maybe because it's more lenient, also it has Kiddushin. If you actually marry, if your brother divorced his wife and you actually gave her Kiddushin, maybe the Kiddushin should be valid. Also, all of these erevas, while they're alive, there is no permission to marry them. Right? Achaysi, show wife, sister, the only permission to marry her is after the sister dies. So if a guy marries Rachel and Rachel dies, so then he's allowed to marry Leah. And that would be true whether Rachel died while they were married or whether Rachel died after they were divorced. However, what's unique about a married woman is that her husband could be alive, everybody's alive, and she's still permitted if her husband gives her a divorce. So maybe you could actually give Kiddushin to a married woman. Okay. So the first attempt of the Gemara, which was, we learned it from, according to the final version, V'haisel ish achar, she can marry somebody else. That excludes Achayis Isha, the sister of a wife. And all erevas are learned from there except for two. But obviously, we still have to answer those two. What is the source that those two don't have Kiddushin? So now we're up to the second attempt. El Omer Rav Yehudah. Rav Yehudah says, "V'itema Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua Omer Kra Kol Asher Yasim Kol Toves Hatayeva Se'ela V'Nichrasim Hokshu Kol Harayis Kulam Lachais Isha Ma'achais Isha Le'Tafs B'Kiddushin Av Kol Harayis Kulam Le'Tafs B'Kiddushin." So Rav Yehudah goes along a similar track, except that he changes as follows. B'haisel ish achar, what does that mean? Not to a relative. Which relative? Achayis Isha, a wife's sister. In other words, she cannot marry the husband of her sister at any point in time, whether it's her actual husband or her ex. Now, says before we were saying that we should make a direct comparison. Says Rav Yehudah, it's not a direct comparison, it's a hekesh. What does a hekesh mean? The Torah equates it. The difference is that a hekesh, you can't point to leniencies. If you're making a comparison, I can undermine the comparison by pointing to a leniency in any one of the subcomponents. But if over here it's not that it is a direct comparison, but if the Torah tells you equate them, they're all equal, so you can't make that argument. It's very simple. The Torah says, anyone who does one of these abominations, they all get the penalty of kares. What we see from here is they're all considered equal to each other. Just like Achayis Isha, a wife's sister, Le'Tafs B'Kiddushin, Av Kol Harayis Kulam Le'Tafs B'Kiddushin. So none of the other ones also have Kiddushin. Okay, if that's the case, if a person marries a woman while she's in Nida, also there should be no Kiddushin, because that also the Gemara considers an erva at this point in the Gemara, and the penalty is kares. The Gemara says, everyone agrees that if somebody has an affair with a nida or with a woman who's a suspected adulterer before it was confirmed, the child is not a mamzer. I.e., there is Kiddushin. You could marry her. It might be prohibited to be with her, but it doesn't change the fact that you can marry her and the child would not be a mamzer. So why not? Why isn't it equated to all the other ervas? So Amar Chizki says, no, nida is an exception. Amar Krovat Hi Nidasa Olav, Afilu B'Shas Nida Teheba Havaya. Even while she's a nida, she can still, there still is Kiddushin. Okay, 1 second. So now we have an exception here, right? In other words, we have a huge segment of erevos. Torah says all of these get kares, but actually, there's really 2 categories of things in this group. What is it? Achos isha, wife, sister. We say there's no Kiddushin. Nida is in the category, and we say there is Kiddushin. So, okay, they're all equal, fine, but in what way are they equal? Exactly. Which way are they equal? Are they all equal to Nida, or are they all equal to Achos isha? If they're all equal to Nida, so then we say there is Kiddushin. If they're all equal to Achos isha, then there's no Kiddushin. So which one is it? Why are we comparing it to Achos isha? Let's compare it to Nida. The Gemara says we have a general rule when we make a hekesh. We have a leniency and a stringency. We equate them for the stringency, not for the leniency. 6 lines down of 68a. Okay, so now we're up to step number 3 in the Gemara, right? The third possibility. We learn it from Yavama. Okay, my Yavama shehi belav. We're talking here about a shemeres yavam, a woman who's eligible for yivam, who's in waiting. Right? So the violation of shemeres yavam is only a lav. Leitafsi b'kedushin. There is no kedushin. Okay, and that's because the Torah specifically says leisiya eish samesh meisa chutz l'ishzar. Basically, there's no kedushin to anyone who's outside of those brothers. So if you have a very lenient prohibition, which is the violation of shemeres yavam, still there's no kedushin. Certainly stringent ones like chayve mis, like a capital punishment, or chayve krisis, which is a heaven ordained death. Loy kolshkein, certainly they should not have kedushin either. Hold on a second. What's the continuation of this argument then? Ihachi chayve lavinami. Then we should say all chayve lavin should be in that category as well. In other words, any prohibition of which the severity is a lav, merely lashes, should also not have kedushin. What's an example of chayve lavin, by the way? A kain to a grusha. Kain is not allowed to marry a grusha. Chayve lavin. Chayve lavin behedik sibu. The Torah specifically mentions kisiyena leishtei noshim ha'achas ahuva ha'achas snua. So without going into the details. Basically, a guy married 2 women. One is a beloved and one is a hated. Okay. Do you think that God sort of is keeping tabs which one he likes and which one he hates? God doesn't really care which one he likes or he hates. That's not the point. The point of the verse is referring to that basically the oldest child remains the oldest child. And even if you don't like the woman that birthed her, he still has a status of the Bechar, and he gets a double portion in the inheritance. Now, the Torah is not really telling you an idea to evaluate which one is more beloved and which one is more hated. Ella, what does it mean? The Torah says a beloved, it means that God likes the marriage. And snua means God hates the marriage because it's prohibited. The Torah says, Kisiyena, that there is Kiddushin. In other words, you could marry a woman that God hates the marriage because it's prohibited. So, for example, let's say a Kayan marries a Grusha and a regular woman, and the Grusha gives birth to his eldest child. That child is his Bechar and takes a double portion, even though God doesn't like the marriage. And the child is a Chol. Okay. So that's the third source. However, there's still a problem here. The problem is that this is the famous opinion of Rabbi Kiva, which we've probably seen at least 3 times before in the Masechta. What does Rabbi Kiva say? Rabbi Kiva says there is no Kiddushin by Chayve Lavin either. So the Rabbi Kiva, Damar ain't Kiddushin types by Chayve Lavin, that even with the Chayve Lav, there's no Kiddushin. A Kayan cannot marry a divorcee. Kisiyena b'may mukim. So how exactly is it possible to have the hated woman if according to him, the hated woman cannot be a grusha? Why not? Because a grusha is a prohibited relationship. There's no kedushin to a grusha. So the Gemara says, it's with an almana to a kain gadol, like the opinion of Rav Simai, the Tanya, we learned Rav Simai Omer min Hakol Hay Rabbi Kiva Oisa Mamzer Chutz Mi Amanal Kohen Gadol. She'Amar Torah Lo Yechal Chilum Hu Oisa Ve'Einoi Oisa Mamzeros. Even though an almana to a Kohen Gadol is a negative commandment, Torah specifically says don't do it. Why? Because you'll make your children halalim. 1 second. According to Rabbi Kiva, by a lav, you make your children way worse than halalim. You make them mamzerim. So why does the Torah say make your children halalim? It's an exception. Torah says it is an exception to almana Kohen Gadol. Even though an almana Kohen Gadol is a lav, there still is Kiddushin. So when the Torah refers to the hated and married woman, what's the Torah referring to? A Kohen Gadol who married an almana. It's a little bit far-fetched. The Gemara notes that later on. The Torah doesn't talk about Kohen Gadol. It's not, the pasuk has no mention to a Kohen even. Okay, but he has no choice. That's how he has to understand the pasuk. Okay. Now this is all good in Rav Simai. Rabbi Shav the Amar. Rabbi Shav the Amar Boyu v'natzuach v'nitzavach eit al Rabbi Kiva ben Yosef. She'omer kol she'en le'biyah b'Yisrael havlad mamzer. So Rabbi Shav was very upset with Rabbi Kiva. He said, look, you're taking every minor prohibition and you're turning the child into a mamzer. Let's go scream at Rabbi Kiva. Okay, so what exactly did Rabbi Shav mean? Now, one possibility is Rabbi Shav was basically referring to Rav Simai. Rav Simai was saying there's an exception to Rabbi Kiva. What's that exception? Amanal Kohen Gadol. And Rabbi Shav was saying, no. I think that according to Rabbi Kiva's opinion, every single lav, including an Amanal Kohen Gadol, all of them do not have Kiddushin. The child is a mamzer. However, chayve essay. Let's say we're talking about a Yisrael who marries a Mitzri Rishon or Mitzri Sheni. That's a chayve essay. There's no mamzeros, and that will be an example of the two women, right? What's the two women? A Yisrael who marries a Mitzri. And a Yisrael marries a Mitzri, and he marries a kosher Yisraelis, and that's the hated and the beloved. But if he's just saying his own reasoning, and his opinion is that Rabbi Kiva basically says any type of prohibited marriage, be it chayve krisis to even chayve essay, a violation of a positive commandment, is also makes the child a mamzer. The ma'mukim law. So then, how exactly is it possible to have a child how is it possible to have a legitimate child of a prohibited wife? Because the child is always going to be a mamzer. And there's never Kiddushin. So the child's never really the child of a married woman. So the Gemara says, a Kohen Gadol marrying a woman who's not a virgin, let's say. Now, let's explain this for a moment. Okay. A Kohen is not allowed to marry a Zayna. A Zayna means that she has had a prohibited relationship. If she has, let's say, had a boyfriend and they slept together, there's no prohibited relationship there. Obviously, they shouldn't be sleeping together, and maybe, especially if she's a nida, but a nida wouldn't invalidate a woman for kahuna. Although I should say that it's a machlokes actually. But where was I? But the relationship isn't one of erva. It's not a prohibited relationship. Certainly, if she's not, if she was a harlot or something, it'll be different. But if she's not, she just has a boyfriend and they slept together. It does not invalidate her for a Kohen Gadol. However, she's still not a basula. She's still not a virgin. A Kohen Gadol has a positive commandment to marry a virgin. Ki im basula me'amav yikachisha. And therefore, the inference from that is he shouldn't be marrying a ba'ula. However, what's unique to this is what we call lava she'ena shava b'kol. The only person who has this positive commandment is the Kohen Gadol. So therefore, this is a more lenient violation of a positive commandment than, let's say, marrying a Mitzri, because every Jew is enjoined not to marry a Mitzri. And therefore, this one, Rabbi Kiva would agree that there is Kiddushin. The child is the child of a hated wife, because God doesn't want the marriage, but the child would not be a mamzer. Okay, fine. So that's the fourth source. According to Rabbi Kiva, no, I'm sorry. Same third source there. Okay. 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 So now the rabbis say as follows. So let's go a little backwards. Let's review. Let's structure this source. What's the question? The question is, how do we know that an Ereva does not have Kiddushin? And the answer is because the Torah says she should be to another woman, and not to who? Not to a relative. Which relative? Her sister's wife. Shouldn't be married to her sister's wife because there is no Kiddushin to her sister's wife. To the husband of her sister, or even the ex-husband of it. Anyone who married her sister. The divorced woman cannot marry her sister's husband or ex-husband. Now, all the arayas are equated to each other, hekesh. So therefore, just like a wife's sister is a prohibited relationship, or in the case of the woman, it will be her sister's ex or her sister's husband. So too, all erevas do not have Kiddushin. Now, hold on a second. There is an ereva that does have Kiddushin. What is it? Nida. So, okay. 1 second. I'm sorry. Started from the wrong starting point. This Gemara doesn't need to come on to that. This Gemara starts earlier. This Gemara says that according to this version of the Gemara, we start from Yivama. Yivama Lashuk is a mild prohibition. It's only a lav, and there's no Kiddushin. Certainly anything that's more stringent, any more stringent violations, severe violations, also don't have Kiddushin. Okay, well, if that's the case, maybe we should make direct comparisons between a Yivama to every Chayve Lavin. Maybe we should say all Chayve Lavin are not included. Also don't have Kiddushin. And the answer is because Chayve Lavin, the Torah specifically says have Kiddushin. How do we know? Because of this beloved and hated wife, which we say that it means that God hates the woman, hates the marriage. Why does God hate the marriage? Because it's Chayve Lavin. Now in Rabbi Kiva, we ended up saying that actually doesn't refer to Chayve Lavin, it refers to Chayve Esei, a violation of a positive commandment. So maybe in the rabbi's opinion also, how do the rabbis know that we're talking about Chayve Lavin, maybe we're referring to Chayve Esei? So therefore maybe Chayve Lavin, the rabbis would agree to Rabbi Kiva. And I'll just continue explaining it outside before we see in the Gemara. The answer is very simple. Who are the Chayve Esei? It's the Mitzri, the Edomi, and the Mayavi. I'm sorry, it's not the Mayavi. It's not that. It's the Mitzri, it's the Kohen Gadol, and the Kohen Gadol, basically. Those are the only Chayve Esei that exist. Now, the implication of Ahuva V'Snua means that the women are basically equal. The only difference is there's some prohibition. But if in the case of a Mitzri, obviously you'll have to presume that there are different nationalities. One's a Mitzri, the other one's a non-Mitzri nationality. And that is not a preferred option. Neither is it preferred to basically say that a pasuk that has no reference at all to Kohanim or Kohen Gadol is limited to a scenario of a Kohen Gadol marrying either an almana or a be'ula, a non-virgin. So therefore, the only thing left basically is to say that it refers to Chayve Lavin, and that's the rabbi's source. The Chayve that while everything else does not have Kiddushin because it's learned from Yivama, Chayve Lavin do have Kiddushin. Okay. Rabbanon Admugla b'Chayve Lavin, Nutma b'Chayve Esei. So Mara says, "Hani Chayve Esei b'Mainenu." What are the Chayve Esei? Ishtei and Mitzvahs, if they're both Egyptians, Shteim Snuas. In other words, if both women are Egyptians, they're both hated because they're both prohibited. Iachas Mitzvahs v'Achas Yisraelos. If he marries one Egyptian woman and one Jewish woman, the presumption here is that they're one nationality. The mission is the verse has no implication of a kayan, and therefore the most logical thing to say is we're talking to the average Chayve Lavin. Okay. Okay, and that would be, what would be an example of that be? Either a grusha to a kayan, or let's say a mamzer to Yisrael, where there is Kiddushin. Okay, so the Gemara says, Iba Ula Kohen Gadol makes Rabbi Kiva, according to Rabbi Kiva, he does say we're talking about a kohen gadol, but that he has no choice but to say the verse refers to beula to a kohen gadol, even though it's sort of not what you would logically conclude. Okay, next Gemara. The final line, the fourth rule in the Mishnah. So let's just review here quickly. Yeah, let's review it. It's worth reviewing. Okay, so there's four rules in the Mishnah. First rule was there is Kiddushin. There's no sin. Child goes based on the father. If there is Kiddushin and there is a sin, the child goes by the blemish of either one. If there is no Kiddushin, but this woman is otherwise eligible, she's in the category of Kiddushin, then the child is a mamzer, there's no Kiddushin. That's what we just saw. And now we move to the final scenario of the Mishnah, which is there's no Kiddushin and she's not eligible for Kiddushin. What does that mean? She's either an indentured maidservant or she is a non-Jew. Okay. So the Gemara wants to know what's the source. What is the source that a indentured maidservant, her children, in the scenario of an indentured maidservant, because there's no Kiddushin at all, the children are determined based on the mother. So the Gemara says, Amar Kra Shvulachem Payim Achamar Amadam El Chamar. Okay, I'm sorry. The Gemara source here is actually that there's no Kiddushin with regard to a shefcha. So the Gemara says, Amadam El Chamar. It's a nation that's sort of compared to a donkey, and therefore there's no Kiddushin. So the Gemara says, V'loda Kamaisim Yinalan. How do we know the child is like her? So the Gemara says, with regard to a maidservant, Torah writes, Ha'isha v'yaladeha tiyala adeinah. The woman and her children stay with the master. This is referring to an Eved Ivri, and he has children. He's permitted to be with a maidservant, an indentured maidservant, but the children stay with the master. They're not his children. So we see here the children go based on the mother. Okay, Nachmer Sminalan. What about a non-Jewish woman? So if a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman, the children are not Jewish. I'm sorry, how do we know there's no Kiddushin? You can't marry them. So he's Ashkachno, so we see from here, Kiddushin, there's no Kiddushin. And how do we know the children are determined based on the woman? Amar Rav Yechon says, Mishum Rav Shimon ben Yechai, in the name of Rav Shimon Yechai, the Amar Kra, the verse states, okay, Ki Yoser es bincha me'acharai. So let's explain this here. This verse is referring to two scenarios. One scenario is where a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman, and where a Jewish woman marries a non-Jewish man. And the concern here, the verse is concerned here. Why? Because maybe ki yasir, meaning the male, as opposed to ki sasar, which would be referring to the female. The male part of this marriage is going to convince your son to follow his ways. Obviously, we're referring to here about a non-Jewish male who's married to a Jewish female, who's going to convince his son, but the Torah calls it your son, the grandfather's son, meaning the grandfather's son. This child is a Jewish child belonging to his mother, in the path of his grandfather, but we're concerned here that his father, who is a non-Jew, is going to convince him to take the wrong pathway. If the Torah were referring to the opposite scenario, where the male was Jewish, so then who's gonna convince the child to be non-Jewish? The female. The Torah should have written kisasser. If the female would convince the child, must be the Torah doesn't actually care about that child. Why not? Because the child is a non-Jew. The child of a Jewish male married to a non-Jewish female is not Jewish. Together? Okay. The child of a female Jew is Yisraelis is called your child, and that's the Torah is concerned with him leaving the pathway. However, the child, one second, the child of someone who comes from a non-Jewish female is not called your child. El b'no, it's called her child. Okay. Amar Ravina Shmami no. So Ravina says we see from here Ben Bitcha Haba Mina Oivek Chavim Kari Bincha. The son of your daughter that married a non-Jew is called your son. Naming a Sava Ravina. So we see from here that Ravina holds Oivek Chavim ve'Eved Abal Bas Yisrael Havlad Mamzer. 1 second. Hold on. Okay, now the fact that Ravina sort of is repeating the implication of Rav Shimon bar Yochai indicates to us that Ravina holds that there's some sort of invalidation with this child. In other words, what Ravina is saying is as follows. 1 second here. Yeah, we'll just finish this point and then we'll stop. Okay, in other words, Ravina is saying is as follows. If the child was a non-Jew, then they would convert and they can marry whoever they want. If the child is a Jew, so we see there's some sort of invalidation there because the marriage was prohibited. So the Gemara presumes the child is a mamzer. Therefore, the child wouldn't be able to get married. So the Gemara says, no. The truth, nehi the kosher lehava. The truth is, it's not. The child is not kosher because his mother violated Torah law to marry a non-Jewish man. Mamzer lehava, posel mikri. We don't call the child a mamzer. Either we call him a potzel, sort of the child is sort of questionable because his father is a non-Jew. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll continue tomorrow. Okay, and then tomorrow should begin the I got the Gemara. So it should be easier for a little bit.